I'm naming this walk Wicked Whitechapel Walk, which is a bit unfair to the residents of today, who are really nice. But it's a catchy name, Wicked Whitechapel Walk. You can say it almost as quickly as www. But the reason being, for three major incidents in history. Number one, the Whitechapel murders, which took place here in the year 1888, between the months of August until late November. And there were more murders carried out than you see on the films, which have been recorded to the main suspect, who no one knows. They've given him a fancy name and I'm not going to mention it. And we have the Kray twins, the gangsters of the East End, and in between them two terrible parts of history is the siege of Sidney Street, the Russian anarchists. So all on this walk, three wicked events. The pub that we're walking by now, the White Hart, going through this archway, you saw the panel on the side of the pub naming one suspect, George Chapman. That was not his real name. He was a Polish immigrant and he changed his name to George Chapman. In Poland, he had qualified as a junior surgeon before coming here. He had rented a basement place in the pub here where he had a barber's shop. He moved to Southwark and then while he was in Southwark he was arrested for the murder of three women who he had poisoned them all. And so by those who are leading the investigation to who was the Whitechapel murderer, he was a main suspect. For his murders of the three women who he poisoned, not related to the Whitechapel murders, he was hanged. This street through the archway used to be called George Yard and still resembles its look from the 1880s. Along here Martha Tabram was murdered on the 7th of August 1888. It's now called Gunthorpe Street and it's right beside the White Hart pub. That archway there is the Wentworth Street Arch, leading to Flower and Dean Walk. This area was a rookery. A rookery is a term for a city slum, densely populated by poor people and with a high number of criminals and prostitutes. Three of the Whitechapel murder victims lodged here in Flower and Dean Walk. There were a number of doss houses here where a rough bed could be rented cheaply for the night. Martha Tabram was born in the year 1849 in Southwark and was named Martha White. At age 16, her father abandoned the family. She married Henry Tabram on Christmas Day in 1869, and they had 2 children. Martha began to drink heavily, and Henry, her husband, left her. He paid 12 shillings weekly maintenance until he learned she was working as a prostitute, dropping allowance to 2 shillings and 6pence. When Martha's husband found out that she was living with another man, he then stopped paying altogether. After that, if Martha ever saw her husband on the street, she begged him for money. Martha Tabram had an on and off relationship with another man until 3 weeks before her death. They lived in rented rooms and common lodging houses while her drinking habit continued. The man Martha had this relationship with was William Turner, no relation to the painter. And when he had money to give her, he said she spent it on drink. And if she needed more money, she sold herself as a prostitute. After not being able to pay her rent for a room where she was staying, Martha left, and in July 1888 moved to a common lodging house in Spitalfields. The 6th of August 1888 was a bank holiday Monday. Martha and another prostitute went drinking together in the late evening, 10 or 11 p.m, and visited several pubs. They met 2 soldiers in the White Swan pub on Whitechapel High Street. The friend went with one soldier into Angel Alley, and Martha went with her soldier into George Yard, which is now here, Gunthorpe Street. A resident of George Yard discovered the dead body of Martha at 4:45 a.m. lying in a pool of blood. In the late summer and autumn of 1888, a series of gruesome murders, first known as the Whitechapel murders, started here with poor Martha Tabram. Here on Whitechapel is the White Hart pub. In 1393, King Richard II's time, an act was passed that all drinking establishments must identify themselves with a sign. Richard II's personal emblem was a white hart or stag. So, to show allegiance to the king, the pub used the king's symbol. The Whitechapel Art Gallery, right next to one of the exits of Aldgate East Station, built in 1899. Now that weather vane on top of the Passmore Eddowes Library shows a man riding on a horse, and he's seating backwards. Not at this green door, but next door, the yellow door, the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. From this very modest building were the great bells of Big Ben, the Bow Bells, that's the St. Mary Le Bow Church, Bow Bells, and the famous crack bell, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, United States, were all made here from this humble dwelling. I'm standing on the corner of Dunbridge Street and Valence Road. Over there used to be, no longer exists, 178 Valence Road. That's where the Kray twins' family home was with their mother. But that 178 Valence Road no longer exists. Here the Kray twins established themselves as East End gangsters. Their mother, Violet Kray, moved here in 1939 to be close to her family. She had two sisters living either side of her, and her brother and father lived on the other side of the road above their cafe. Ronnie Kray was known to have a collection of suits, knives and swords. This is the famous Repton Boxing Club, and this is just a stone throw away from where the Kray twins as boys grew up. So this is where they learnt their boxing. Okay, we're going to walk just underneath Bethnal Green train station there, down Tab Street, make our way into Collingwood Street, which will bring us out to Cambridge Heath Road, and then before we turn right along Whitechapel Road, we're going to look at Sidney Street. I'm calling this walk Wicked Whitechapel. That's very unfair to the people today who are living here. They've been nothing but friendly, really nice people, very helpful. Been walking through the Borough Tower hamlets and Bethnal Green and maybe the poorest borough in London, but I've really enjoyed this walk. As I say, everyone really nice, friendly, no problem at all. Haven't had a bad look from one person. Only if they have to look over my shoulder. More chance of getting mugged in Park Lane than down here. Most people in this neighbourhood be on pretty low wage, minimum wage or just above, just like me. As I say, really friendly people. Very helpful, very nice people here. At number 8 Tap Street, it's now residential. There used to be a pub there called the Lion, also known as the Widow, but this was closed in the year 2002. Okay, so I'm walking away from Tap Street, where behind me was the pub, the Widow, which was its nickname. The pub was called the Lion, but it was nicknamed the Widow because the landlady there was a widow, and it became very popular with the Kray twins. She was friendly with them, and that's where they used to meet with their gang, the gang. And they even stashed back there in the Widow pub all of their weapons, knives, swords. They didn't want to leave all their weapons at their home, so they were stashed there, the Widow. Ronnie Kray was drinking here before leaving here with Ian Barry and a driver, and made their way to the Blind Beggar, where Ronnie Kray shot dead George Cornell. This would ultimately lead to the Kray's imprisonment. This is another different White Hart pub. And up there you can actually see the original White Stag, the White Hart. Along there is Sidney Street. The famous siege of Sidney Street used to be a row of terrace houses, now completely demolished. 2 or 3 heavily armed Russian anarchists were hiding here after attempting to rob a jewellery shop and killing 3 policemen in the process. So you'll have to imagine the scene of up to 400 police and military firing at this one house. Even Winston Churchill, the Home Secretary of the time, was in attendance offering advice. And the fire brigade became involved because it was a fire that ended the battle burning through the house. The reason the anarchists were able to keep so many police at bay was because their firearm power was much more modernised, much more powerful, while the police only had old rifles. That says in memory of District Officer Charles Pearson of the London Fire Brigade, who died from injuries received at 100 Sidney Street, near this site, during the siege of Sidney Street on the 3rd of January 1911. Did I forget to mention how the fireman died? So here's Wexford House. So what beat the anarchists in the end was a fire. A fire raged through their house. When they were discovered, when the firemen were able to get in, they only discovered 2 bodies, 2 dead bodies. So that meant Peter the painter got away. The firemen were not allowed in until they had put out the flames. So they doused the house with lots and lots of water. When they thought it was safe to go in, the first fireman that went in, unfortunately, the ceiling collapsed, and one of them, as we see on the plaque there, Pearson, he broke his spine. And 6 months later, survived for 6 months, but due to the injuries he finally died, tragically. So now we have that plaque for the brave fireman. This is Durwood Street. There's a short walk away from the Blind Beggar pub. At approximately at 3:40 a.m. on the 31st of August 1888, Mary Ann Nichols was found dead by Carter Charles Cross. She'd been thrown out of her doss house 2 hours earlier because she did not have money for her rent. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly by her friends, had a difficult upbringing and a life filled with continuous struggles. This led to problems in her relationships and then to poverty. As Mary Ann Donovan once famously said to the judge, "What is a poor girl to do?" Also for Polly, she has succumbed to the habit of drinking, which only made her an easy target for the beast that murdered her. A pub once stood here called the Frying Pan. Mary Ann Nichols, Polly, was seen coming out of this pub at 2 a.m. the night she was murdered. She was an alcoholic, as were many of the prostitutes who worked these streets. And you can just make out there the sign, 2 frying pans. It says ye, meaning thee, ye frying pan, the frying pan. We're now in Hanbury Street, not far away from the Truman Brewery. In the year 1888, on the opposite side of the street from these older looking houses where it's now modernised, on the 8th of September, the murdered body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of number 29. As a child, Annie was the eldest in her family. In 1845, tragedy struck when 4 out of 5 of her siblings died of typhus, a disease spread by insect bites. Annie was only aged 12 or 13 when this happened. What a shock. At age 22, her father committed suicide. He was in the army and he cut his own throat. Annie did get married, but tragedy continued. She had 3 children who all only lived a very short time. She had a son who survived, but he was crippled. Her husband then got a good position as a coachman on an estate that came with a house. But sadly, Annie took to drinking heavily, and it wasn't Buxton mineral water. So bad was her drinking that she was put into a sanatorium by her family. After being there for 1 year, she recovered and returned home, only to start drinking again. And so her and her husband separated. And so from there she ended up in a common Whitechapel lodging house. She sold flowers to start with, but then entered prostitution. Another alcoholic because of the terrible tragedies in her life, and another easy victim. In this walk I've hardly spoken about the murderer, and I don't want to. Doesn't deserve a mention. Should be just forgotten as far as I'm concerned. But it's the victims we should remember. They lived hard lives, miserable lives, childhoods so tough. We've learned that they lost their siblings in their childhood to illnesses. They lost their parents to illnesses or suicide. As they grow up, they fall on hard times, trying to make ends meet, with no benefits to fall back on. They enter prostitution. How can they live with prostitution? Through drink. And so they drink and they drink. They become alcoholics. And then in that state, they're taken advantage of. So that's who we remember on this walk, the victims. This area is called Whitechapel because the first church built on this site in the 13th century was made out of chalk brought in from Kent. So it was a white coloured chapel. Whitechapel. The Whitechapel no longer exists here, just a few of the foundation stones. Mulberry Street, once called Zion Square in 1888, and home to at least one, maybe two suspects of the Whitechapel murders. At the corner there of Henrique Street and Fairclough Street, where the school is now, in the year 1888, it was the International Working Men's Educational Club. At 1 a.m. in the night time, on the 30th of September, the club steward, Louis Demschutz, bringing his horse and cart into the yard, came across the body of Elizabeth Stride, dead but not butchered. Elizabeth Stride was born in Sweden, and as a young woman there she lost a baby while 7 months pregnant. She came to England in the year 1866 to work as a domestic servant for a family in the Hyde Park area of London. And here she learnt English and Yiddish. So obviously an intelligent woman. But her employment came to an end. I don't know why. And in 1869 she started to work at a respectable boarding house. Here she met John Stride, to whom she married. The couple had no children, sadly probably due to the effects of losing her child while she was in Sweden. Sadly, the couple departed ways. By 1888, Elizabeth was lodging in the Spitalfields and Whitechapel districts. She had an on and off and stormy relationship with one man. And once again, drinking alcohol became a big theme in her life too. She received assistance at times from the Swedish church. And she also stayed in a workhouse when she had no money for the lodging house. Elizabeth was really struggling. In the year 1888, she was staying at a lodging house at number 32 Flower and Dean Street. Despite women at the same lodging house being very scared of the spat of murders in Whitechapel at the time, Elizabeth went drinking late at night. Again, another woman enduring a miserable life and drinking heavily, making another easy victim for a murderer or murderers. And unfortunately and tragically, Elizabeth Stride was not the only victim that night. This is Golding Street, and this was where once stood Grave Street. Peter the Painter, one of the gang of the Russian Anarchists, lived here at number 59. After the burglary of the jewellery shop, the gang came here. From the fight with a policeman who was shot dead, the gang's leader, George Garstein, was wounded, and at Peter the Painter's house here he died. The rest of the gang left their leader's body here and fled to hide in Sidney Street. This, also a very modest building, is the Worshipful Company of Gunmakers, established by Royal Charter in 1637. This one here on Commercial Road and one in Birmingham are the only two in the whole of the UK where all guns sold in the UK must be brought here, or to the one in Birmingham, to be tested for basic soundness of barrel and action. On the corner of St Mark's Street is the oldest Indian restaurant in East London, and supposedly still the best. Here in Goodman's Fields is just part of what once was a large meadow. The famous Dick Turpin, along with accomplice Robert King, had a famous pistol gunfight with men of the law in the year 1737. They had been spotted stabling a stolen horse at a nearby inn. King died from a gunshot, but Dick Turpin escaped. And it is very possible Dick Turpin stabled his stolen horse in this old inn. We're not far from Goodman's Meadows. The church there in the background is St Botolph's, first founded in the year 1125, rebuilt in the 1740s by George Dance the Elder, and then hit by a bomb in 1941. It was well known that many prostitutes walked around the church grounds here as a safe place to walk, waiting for customers to approach them. It was against the law for a prostitute to do the approaching, and it was against the law for a prostitute to stand in one spot for too long. And it was here that Catherine Eddowes came soon after being released from Bishopsgate Police Station at about 1 a.m. She had been arrested earlier for being drunk, a common theme with the Whitechapel murders. Her murderer most likely met her here before taking her to Mitre Square. The dead body of Catherine Eddowes was found in the early hours of the 30th of September, the second murder victim on the same night. And it says on this plaque, in the summer of 1888, Eddowes had been casually employed hop-picking in Kent. Back in London on the night before her death, she recorded as staying in a workhouse. The following day, she was arrested for drunkenness in Aldgate High Street, giving her name as nothing. Within an hour of her release, she was found murdered. Catherine was the sixth child of 10 siblings. Her parents moved the family to London from Wolverhampton to find more work opportunities. Catherine's mother died from an illness when Catherine was 13 years old. Just a few months later, Catherine's father died of the same illness, which was tuberculosis. Catherine returned to Wolverhampton, where she started work. She lost her job because of stealing. The family she was with then sent her to stay with an uncle in Birmingham. Catherine left this uncle's family to move in with a man she fell in love with. They had 5 children together. Sadly, 2 of the children died in their infancy. The family moved from place to place selling books to make a living. They ended up in London. At this time, Catherine started drinking heavily. The couple split, and Catherine ended up living in Flower and Dean Street, Spitalfields, while she had one sister living close by in Whitechapel. She cleaned for Jewish families in Brick Lane. When she did not earn enough money to make ends meet, she turned to prostitution. As it said on that information board, during the Kent picking season, Catherine worked there. This shows she really tried to work honestly, but due to bad weather, the hop picking season was very short, and she returned to the Whitechapel Spitalfield district. On the opposite side, from Goring Street across Houndsditch, where now the building work is going on, was once a jewellery shop at number 119, which was the jewellery shop which the gang of the siege of Sidney Street tried to break into from the dwelling connected to it at the back, before being interrupted by the police. 3 policemen were killed in trying to apprehend them. The policemen only had truncheons. The gang had guns. 2 more police were seriously injured during the fight. This happened at 11:30 p.m. at night on the 16th of December in the year 1910. Now, about where that yellow painted window frames are would be whereabouts 48 Goulstone Street was. In the year 1888, it was here at about 2:50 a.m. PC Alfred Long found a piece of Catherine Eddowes' bloody apron. It's likely that the killer wiped the blade of his knife and his hands on the piece of apron. Was he near home? Was this his home? Or was he simply just playing with the police? This building in Crispin Street opened in 1860 as the Providence Row Night Shelter to ease the suffering of destitutes. This is Brushfield Street, and somewhere in a passageway lived Mary Kelly, just aged 25. Across the road at Spitalfields Market. She was murdered by the killer between 3:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. on the morning of the 9th of November. Her body was discovered by her landlord's agent, who had come to collect her overdue rent. She was the last known victim of the Whitechapel murderer. She was the only victim that we have mentioned on this walk who was renting a room of their own and was murdered indoors, leaving the most horrific murder scene. There is very little known about Mary Jane, but it is believed that she was born in Limerick, Ireland, and the family first moved to Wales before Mary Jane moved to London. She turned to prostitution before moving to Spitalfields, but it was here where she started drinking heavily. She was very unhappy with her life. Mary Jane Kelly, one of the Whitechapel murder victims, lived here. There is a 10 Bells pub, which was here in the year 1888 and was a favourite drinking establishment for at least 4 of the Whitechapel victims: Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Strive, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was seen drinking at the 10 Bells on the evening before her murder. Christchurch, architect Nicholas Hawksmoor.
Surveys on the rest of the line. The Elizabeth line is partially closed between Good service on the rest of the line. Good service on other London Underground lines, other DLR routes, other London Overground routes, other Elizabeth line routes.